All right, y'all, we are streaming live here on YouTube. It is noon Pacific time on Friday, which is May the 3rd, and I'm excited to be back with you. It's been kind of a different week. The last few weeks we've been streaming every day, mostly around 9 o'clock in the morning. This week it's been a little bit more sporadic. I think we streamed on either Monday or Tuesday, I forget, and then we streamed today and no other time during the week. So I just want to acknowledge that it's been a little bit off kilter and say that if you're a regular to these streams, it's going to be a little off kilter for a while yet. I'm just sort of rearranging some things in my professional and personal schedule. But if you'll bear with me, I trust that we're going to have a great time together. Today, we're going to be talking about the Parashat Hashavua. That is the Torah portion of the week. And now that Passover is over, we are back to the regular Torah portion cycle, which means today's Parsha, or rather this week's Parsha that people will be reading in the synagogue tomorrow, is Acharei Mot, which means after death. And it's specifically speaking of the death of the sons of Aharon, the high priest. His sons Nadav and Avihu, few weeks back, started work on a bad note, right? It was their first day of being priests in the temple, and immediately they screwed up. They brought the wrong kind of fire on their incense or something like that, and they got schmeiced. They got zapped. It says they approached the holy place, and fire came out and burned them to death. And so then we had some weeks talking about skin conditions. Then we had a couple of weeks talking about Passover. And now it's sort of like, meanwhile, back to the story. After the death of Nadav and Avihu, we are told the prescriptions for Yom Kippur, right? How do we celebrate Yom Kippur? And in this parsha, we have a few different things going on. One is a particular ritual for Yom Kippur that involves goats. We don't do that anymore, but back in the day, it involved goats. There are some other general rules for sacrifices. And then Leviticus 18, see, 16 is Yom Kippur, 17 is more like general rules about sacrifices and blood and stuff like that. Leviticus 18 talks a lot about, let's say, improper sexual relations that for the most part are things with like family and animals and things that sort of defy the ability to consent to sexual relations, which is why they're kind of off limits. And just to teach you that Judaism is very while being sex positive, is very keen and very serious about consensual relations. Even where it talks about, which gets kind of controversial for some people, it talks about men not lying with men. And a lot has been made of that in religious settings, and it mystifies me that some religions say, oh, we're going to not keep the kosher thing anymore, and we're not going to keep the Sabbath anymore, but we're going to take this line very seriously that allows us to hate gay people and maybe even murder them, which is also in like the top 10 of mitzvahs that you don't do. I read that very differently, understanding the history of that time period, where I believe that reverse is talking about masters and slaves in that situation, and that's why it's prohibited. So I've talked about that at length before. Just wanted to give you kind of an overview before we get into talking about goats, which Leviticus 18 says you're not supposed to have sex with them. But on Yom Kippur, you are supposed to do something else with them. But before we get too deep into that, I just want to say hello to everybody who's coming in. I got a kind of a frog in my chest today. We'll talk about that in a bit. That's had some impact on my week. We are going to do like a bit of we're going to do some, excuse me, some live stuff. I got to get me, need a little clean out the pipes here, grab some water. And let's see, red leather, yellow leather, unique New York, unique New York. She sells seashells by the seashore. And so, look, this is a little bit all over the place. If you're just tuning in for the first time and you were looking for like a Torah in 2 minutes kind of situation or 90 seconds on the Parashat Hashavua, there's lots of that out there on the internet. We're going to hang out for a while. This is usually about 45-minute, hour-long show where we sit and we discuss and take a lot of comments from the people in the chat. So if you're watching, I'll say, like, if you want to lurk, you do you, right? I don't want to call anybody out. But if you have questions, if you have thoughts on this Parsha, if you have just want to shout out and say hi to people, and you don't even have to you say hi to me, but you could say hi to other people. A lot of people I see in the chat are like friends with each other now. So they just like, hey, what's going on, yo? And so that's how people interact. So this is a different kind of show than you might see elsewhere on YouTube. We're going to hang out for a while. We're going to talk about the Parsha. I'll take any questions that people want to ask, and I encourage conversation among people in the chat. Like, not a lot of teachers will say, hey, you in the back of the room, stop gossiping with each other. Not me. In this format, I love it when people talk to each other in the chat. So feel free to go right ahead. So if you're just joining us, again, today we're going to be talking about the Parashat Hashavua, and that is Parashat Acharei Mot, which is I want to say like the 6th Torah portion in Leviticus, and it starts off with Acharei Mot, after the death of Aaron's sons. God talked about some rituals for Yom Kippur involving a couple of goats. Spoiler alert, in this Parsha, we get the term scapegoat, or rather we get the concept of a scapegoat, or actually this is where the concept of the scapegoat comes from. And so I'll invite you to think about, okay, what does scapegoat mean to you? Like, what is, when you call somebody a scapegoat, or you say, oh, somebody scapegoated somebody else, what does that mean? And so I want to teach that in this Parsha, the story that we're about to talk about is where that phrase comes from. And you'll see exactly how it is in context. Get yourself a little bit of cultural literacy there. And we'll unpack what we can learn from this situation. Like, hey, scapegoating's in the Torah. Does that mean I should go around doing it? No, because while this is something that happens in the Torah, it's not a complete picture of how one distances oneself from, some people might say sin, or I'll say suboptimal activity, not living your best life, if you want to get kind of frou-frou with it. There is this instance of sort of distancing yourself from things in yourself that you're not proud of by putting them on something or someone else and chasing that away. It's like, oh, it's not me anymore. It's that guy's fault. But that's not the completion of atonement on Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur actually requires a lot of other personal work, for which that scapegoat ceremony is just sort of a symbolic ritual to mark that occasion. It's not the entirety of how one atones. So before we get too deep into this, I want to go ahead and set up an intro for the podcast. God willing, I should get this edited before Shabbat. Haven't been doing a great job of that lately, but really want to focus on sharing this with the Jew Curious Show podcast audience. So let's do this. Hero, have you ever been tempted to take something you're not proud of and blame it on somebody else? Have you ever been tempted to make someone or something your scapegoat? Do you know where the phrase scapegoat comes from? In this episode, we will take a look at the Torah portion of the week, Acharei Mot, and find out about the original scapegoat. And what we can learn from this that can help us grow today, right after this bass. Going to make a little room for intro music here, which I can't play on the live stream because the music is copyrighted. I do have permission to use it, but YouTube always flags it when I throw it on YouTube, so I'm going to not do that. Thank you, Ron. Thank you, Joey Weissenberg and the Hadar Ensemble, for those inspiring opening beats. Thank you to the live studio audience who has joined me today for this discussion of the Torah portion of the week. And most of all, thank you, Hero, for listening to the Jew Curious Show. As I said, we are doing this in a live studio recording format, which means I have a lot of people joining me on YouTube Live. Just want to give some shout-outs to my friends. Looks like we've made Minion here. Kathy's coming in from Southern California. Karen from Philly. Silvisimas Chaparra from sunny Florida. Very nice to have you here, Silvisimas. Abigail Truman says, good evening. Wonder what time zone you're in, Abigail. Fernando says, shalom from NYC. Drake from Huntsville, Alabama. Home of many wonderful things, including Space Camp. Yes, I was a nerd. And am still one. We got Miriam in from New Hampshire, but on the way to Massachusetts. Nothing wrong with that. Courtney Smith, nice to see you here, Courtney. Yosef Rodriguez says hello from Boston. Welcome, Yosef. Glad to see you here. And somebody named First says, good morning from Anchorage, Alaska. Glad to have you here first. Glad to have you here last. Glad to have you here in the middle. Anytime you join us is great. So we are coast to coast and worldwide, y'all. Okay, today we're going to talk about the Torah portion of the week. Before we do, I'm going to give a little bit of a pause. I want to reach out to some of my friendlies and frenemies and all sorts of Jew-curious heroes who have been regular viewers on this live stream. So I'm just going to talk to the live stream folks for a second. I'll probably edit this out of the podcast, God willing it gets there. So for the last few weeks, I've been doing a live video every single day of the week, just about, mostly at 9 a.m. And I've really enjoyed the kind of community that we've built. And now I'm experimenting a little bit. Just when you think it's safe, just when you think we have a rhythm, I really strive to be consistent with my teaching as much as possible. In the Jew Curious School itself, the classes are always at fixed times throughout the week and don't change that much unless I have some sort of emergency out of town kind of thing. But still with the YouTube channel, I'm doing a little bit of experimenting. And I'll say I'll be continuing to experiment. So next week, it's not going to be any more consistent than it was this week. But whenever I do a live, I'll try to give you a few hours heads up on the email. So the best thing to do if you like to be tuned into these things, there's a couple things you could do. Subscribe to the live channel and check back periodically. Whenever I have a live thing, I like to schedule them in advance and you can see when they're going to be. Another great way is to be connected to my email list, and you can do that by going to jewcurious.show/JCC. Now, that is a place to sign up with your email address, and you get instructions on how to join the Jew Curious Community Center on Facebook, but it will also have you in my email list so that when I send out email broadcasts, you will get automatically notified as to whatever is going along. So please bear with me. I really appreciate your patience. Another thing that I appreciate is that people have been checking in with me when I don't appear at the normal time. People have expressed concern. And so I didn't mean to make anybody upset or make anybody worried about me. I am gratified that you miss me when I'm gone. Like, I'm really gratified that people are caring about my well-being. And that's another thing I want to share with the live audience, and I may not put this on the podcast, is that I mentioned on this show, I guess a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about Passover, that Passover is all about leaving Egypt. And yet we are told, it's not just we left Egypt back in the day, but every person is sort of invited to see themselves as if they themselves were leaving Egypt on Passover, which means, every year we sort of have to face up to what is our Egypt today. Like, if I see myself leaving Egypt now, then that implies that there's some sort of Egypt that I'm in, whether it's physically Egypt, and it's a very different place than it was back then, and a very different relationship to the Jews, sometimes better, sometimes worse, I don't know. But what in your life is this sort of narrow place, which the Hebrew word for Egypt, Mitzrayim, means the narrows, which was probably referring to the narrowness of the Nile River Valley, where all of that civilization sort of clung close to the banks of the Nile, which is where sort of their source of life and prosperity, etc. But what's a place that has you in a tight squeeze? And what's a place that you might have to struggle to leave? And there's another contemporary author who says, in some way and form, everybody is in Egypt. But everybody in Egypt also has a promised land, and the only way you can get there is by marching with others, right? You don't leave Egypt by yourself. You don't get to the promised land by yourself. You're sort of marching with other people. And a couple of things one thing that I shared is that one of my personal Egypts this year is my health. Now, again, don't want to freak anybody out. There's nothing like chronically wrong with me that I know of. It's just that over the last few months, I've put on some weight. I've been exercising less because I've been really focused on building up our school and building up this channel. But I've sort of lost focus on my health. And so over the last week, it's sort of explained some of the sporadicness. I've been to a doctor for a complete checkup. I've had like various things poked and prodded. I've gotten blood work and an x-ray and a stress test. And, for no like big reason that I know of, just because it's just been a while since I've been to the doctor, and it's been a while since I've had a good exercise or diet routine. And so I spent a lot of time in the doctor's office this week. I've also spent a lot of time more exercising than I have been. And this may shock you, but my primary form of exercise right now is hot yoga. So if I it might not strike some of you as a yogi, but I've been spending a lot of time in a very hot room doing yoga just about every day for the last week and a half. I've also drastically altered my diet. And the people are tuning in to learn about Jewish stuff. You don't really care about this, but just to say that, I shared a couple of weeks ago what my Egypt was. And knowing that I have good friends and good family and a few medical professionals and a couple of yoga instructors to march with me, just wanted to give you an update as this is how I'm getting out of my Egypt. So stay tuned for that, and probably talking a little faster than normal. I have a ton of energy. Went to yoga this morning. Had like a bulletproof coffee. That's a thing now. So I feel bulletproof and awake, and drinking a lot more water and less coffee than I used to. So that's what's up. And I really appreciate people sort of reaching out to me, seeing if everything was okay, especially because I know a lot of people have been having a hard week. Not because of, like my own, I've had my own things going on, but then our community has had other things going on. We spoke earlier this week about the shooting in Poway, California, at a synagogue on Shabbat on the last day of Passover. And if you want to hear that discussion, it's the last video we did. So just check out another video on this YouTube channel, and really appreciate people showing up for that, sharing their own thoughts, sharing their questions, sharing support with one another. I think that's what's the best thing about these live sessions. And it wasn't even the most recent shooting that we've had this week. There was another one in, I believe, North Carolina, in Charlotte, at a school, where a couple of people lost their life. And it was Yom Hashoah. And sort of right in the wake of some anti-Semitic violence, we have a day remembering the 6 million Jews who lost their lives in the Holocaust during World War II. Just to point out, it's not just Yom HaShoah. It's in Israel. It's also called Yom HaShoah Ugvura. Like, we remember those who perished, and we also remember those who fought back. In terms of like the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and the Jewish resistance movement and the Haganah, and people who went from Israel, who were settled in Israel for a generation or so, going to Europe to fight against the Nazis with the resistance. So that's another thing that we mark this week. So it's been kind of an emotional roller coaster, mostly going down, but I've really been gratified and amazed to see how people show up for one another. And that's true about this channel, how people have been talking to each other and supporting one another and sharing ideas. That's true about the Jew Curious School itself, where we have a private community forum where people have been talking to each other and lifting each other up. That's true about the Jewish community at large, how people have come together across different denominations to show solidarity with this community in Poway. And it's true in an interfaith sense as well. In the last few weeks, we've had a very high-profile mass murder of Muslims in New Zealand and Christians in Sri Lanka, and I'll say different, smaller body count. Not that feels better, but an assault on a Jewish community because it was a Jewish community. So all of these things show that there's not just one group of people suffering, but they also have shown me, in the response that I've seen, how we are willing to support each other despite our differences. And it reminds me so much of when 9/11 happened. Mr. Rogers, Alava Shalom, may his memory be for a blessing, went on the air to help kids process what they were hearing and what they were seeing their parents yell about and cry about. And Mr. Rogers, Pastor Fred Rogers, I should say, said to people, or said to the kids, when you see something scary, look for the helpers, right? Look for the people running into the building. Look for the people who are the first responders, the police officers, the fire people, their firefighters, the medical people who are helping each other out. And it was remarkable to see after this thing happened in the Chabad of Poway, California, the helpers who jumped in to help. The helpers who provided medical assistance, the people in the congregation who chased down the guy who was shooting, the people who the outpouring of support I've experienced from non-Jews who called me up and said, "Hey, this was in Southern California. You're in Southern California." Like I didn't have I told them like that's 2-3 hours away from me, but still, people just sort of calling and saying, "Are you okay? And what can I do to help?" So that, wish that we didn't need that, but it's been very gratifying to see that. So don't know how I got on that tangent, but I just wanted to say Yasher Koach to this community for being supportive of everybody. So let's just see what's going on in the chat. I just want to give some shout outs here. A lot of people joining us. Karen says, good to see everybody. Miriam says, the best show on YouTube. I don't know if you're talking about this show or another show, but if it's this show, thank you. Kathy says, if you like, click like if you enjoy these broadcasts. Thanks for that, Kathy. Really appreciate that. Let's see. People are sharing the weather where they're coming from. Teresa is here from Cyprus. We are international. Carla says in an area of poor connection, so it keeps buffering. I hope this is coming through okay. The sound, I haven't heard any comments on the sound, so I'll assume it's okay. Carla, good to see you. So Mamo Hassan says, Shalom Rav, very good to see you, Mamo. Thank you, Miriam. You're going to make me blush. I'm going to have to get a bigger door to get my ego out of here, but thank you for that, I'll say. So somebody was asking me, what about my trainer? Courtney's been following me for a while, asked me, I was working with a trainer at one point. Andy, my wife still works with him, but I've sort of shifted over from personal training to a yoga class, just because, personal training is wonderful, and I love that guy, and he transformed my life, and he's very expensive. And so because I make most of my living online now, we're doing yoga class instead. So very good to see everybody here. All right. Ari says, I finally finished cleaning the kitchen. That's why. Is that for next Passover, or are you getting rid of the Passover stuff? So it's good to see. Grycicle from Marin County saying Shul is taking some security measures. One thing, if anybody has access to it, there was a great discussion this week. I believe it was yesterday. I was in the car quite a bit yesterday. And I got to hear on NPR, and I think this might have been like the local NPR affiliate here. So I don't know if it's all over the place, but at least, look up, I forget, is it KCRW, or look for one of the Los Angeles public radio broadcasts. There was a discussion with two gentlemen. One was a guy, I forget his name, but he runs a security company called Kadima, and it's a security company that helps protect synagogues and other houses of worship. And he was talking about, how places can make themselves more safe. And after him, they had a teacher of mine, Rabbi Dr. Aryeh Cohen, who is my favorite all-time Talmud professor. Sorry to my other Talmud professors. I don't want to pick favorites. They were all great. But he is a favorite Talmud professor of mine. And he had a very different take. And he was talking about, on the one hand, our instinct within Jewish communities is to maximize our 3 Gs, which means gates, guards, and guns, right? We think that if we build or close gates, if we have more guards, and if there are guns on the property, that we will be safe. And he wanted to challenge that notion of saying, just having those things there makes people feel more safe, but doesn't always actually make people safe in a sense, and it doesn't even necessarily make some people feel safe. So if, I defer to every community to decide for itself what it wants to do. But what he was talking about is, yes, communities go to that place of sort of visible security measures, barriers, capacity for violence, for things like that as a way to protect. And he was arguing for an alternative or perhaps an additional path of real, let's say, long-term security, which has to do with learning situational awareness, like how to know if your environment is safe or unsafe, learning de-escalation tactics so that if things are sort of, starting to get serious or dangerous, that we have ways to diffuse those in the moment. And also a kind of real solidarity among people from different communities. And he said, what would it be like if for Friday prayers in Muslim communities, if there were a bunch of Jews standing out front of the building, just guarding the place, just saying, just being present, and they don't have to be all, tacticaled out or anything like that. They could just be standing there and saying, okay, anybody who's going to come and do violence in this Muslim space, you have to get through us Jews first. Or Christians, showing up at a synagogue, hanging out front on a Saturday saying, we're here standing with the Jewish community, and vice versa. And so what would it be like if communities were really open to getting to know each other and saying to one another, if anybody's going to hurt you, they have to get through me first? And I think just the dialogue that would spark, like aside from the physical presence of people, just the dialogue that would spark would go a very long way to making all of our communities feel more secure, feel better about other people in those, because I know that this kind of violence sparks an instinct for xenophobia. I was teaching a class last night, and I wanted to make room for people to talk about their reaction to Poway, I forget how to say it. And this guy in the class said, well, we have to deal with this problem of Islam. And I said, I'm going to shut you down right there, because that's that kind of language, first off, which had nothing to do with Poway whatsoever. Nobody involved was Muslim. But I think his was an instinctive reaction to say, okay, we make ourselves safer by scapegoating somebody else, or by calling out, somebody else being dangerous, and characterizing a mass of people in a way that I thought, I just said in front of my whole class, we're going to stop that right now, because first off, I think that kind of language is the kind of divisiveness that got us here to begin with. And I know there are lots of Jewish people and rabbis who disagree with me about this. But that's A, not constructive, B, not true, C, actually contributing to the problem. And I really feel like the more we get to know different people in our communities, and the more different people in our communities get to see us for who we are, the safer we become. And that's why I always advocate, look, you don't get safe by hiding. And this was a disposition of a particular synagogue that I was a part of. They said, hey, we're going to be safe as long as nobody knows what's going on here. As long as we don't advertise what we're doing, we keep a very low profile in the community. And that's just not, in the age of the internet, anybody who wants to find you to do harm can find you, regardless of, just keeping your head down. B, it's sort of a terrible way to draw new people into the community. and see, like, I really believe that the more people stand up and say, hey, we are a part of this community just like you are. And when people in the community see that, they say, oh, I might be hearing some negative stuff about Jews from other people who don't know Jews, but I know Jews now, and so I'm going to ignore that stuff. And in fact, I'm going to speak on behalf of Jews in the public sphere. And I've really seen a change in the public attitude over the last few years because of that kind of work here where I live. So that's just wanted to give that shout out. So Trig B, good to see you. Says, miss everyone so much this week. Good to see you, Trig. Glad you're here. So now that we're about 30 minutes in, I should probably talk about what I said I was going to talk about, which is Acharei Mot. So let's get into it. In Acharei Mot, as I said, we've got sort of three main sections, roughly corresponding to chapters 16, 17, and 18 of the book of Leviticus, or Sefer Vayikra, if you're playing along in Hebrew. And the first section has to do with a particular ritual for Yom Kippur back in the times of the Mishkan and the temple when we did animal sacrifices. We don't, just to be super clear, anymore. And then 17 is roughly more general rules for sacrifices and the disposition of blood and things like that. And then 18 is a discussion of sexual taboos for the Jewish people. And so I want to focus on 17 in this particular ritual that God gives to Aharon, Aaron the high priest. And he says, here's what you do. You take, and you just do this, you don't do this every day, you just do this on Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year. What I want you to do is take 2 goats, and they should be, according to the Mishnah, they should be roughly identical. They're not going to be twins or anything, but they should be, about the same size, about the same, market value, what have you. But they should be, pretty much good substitutes for one another. They should be equal goats. And then you draw lots between them, right? You sort of pick them at random for different tasks. And how you do this, as they said in the Mishnah and in the Gemara, you have a box. One has a tile or something, something that has the name of God printed on it, the Tetragrammaton, Yud He Vav He, which for the newbies out there is not pronounced Yahweh. That's a thing that people say that Jews worship Yahweh or Jehovah, and both of those are like bad transliterations of biblical Hebrew. Yud He Vav He is actually an unpronounceable word that we use just in print, but don't actually pronounce. So if you have this, you have one label with Yud He Vav He on it, and you have another that says Ozs L. And we'll get into who this Ozs L was in a second. But you reach in, you don't look, you pick out these 2 tiles and you put them towards the 2 different goats. And so at random, one goat is going to be designated for God, and one goat is going to be dedicated to Ozs L. And so the goat that's dedicated to God is sort of slaughtered right there in the holy space, along with the other sacrifices for Yom Kippur. The one that is for Ozs L has a different procedure. And you may be wondering, okay, what is this Ozs L? Who is this Ozs L? And why are we giving him a goat? Especially considering that we like to pride ourselves on being non-pagan monotheists. Now, Ozs L, there's a few traditional stories about him. Doesn't talk too much about Ozs L in the Torah itself. There is some apocryphal literature, sort of non-canonical, contemporary, and later writings. One is the book of Enoch, which is, I think, a later concoction sort of talking about Enoch in the early parts of Genesis. Enoch was this character, one of the descendants of Adam, about whom, like Elijah the prophet, it never talks about his dying. It says for everybody else, so-and-so lived so many years and then he died, and he begot so-and-so who lived so many years and then he died. Enoch, or Hanoch in Hebrew, it doesn't say that he died, and so he's sort of considered this immortal being. And in the book of Enoch, and this is, sort of rich territory for mystics and stuff to mine different ideas kind of outside of the mainstream of what's in the Torah. But in the book of Enoch, it talks about another thing that's in the Torah that's not really described too much. In the Torah, it says there was this generation of, let's say, divine beings who came down and inhabited the earth and, let's say, consorted with earthling women and had children. And these were the heroes of old, the men of renown, sort of like you read about demigods like Heracles, aka Hercules, in Greek mythology. But it doesn't really elaborate on that. The book of Enoch does, where it talks about these different, some people would say fallen angels, angels that came to earth. And one of them is Azazel. Nachmanides, let's see, Nachmanides, I think it's Reb Moshe ben Nachman, kind of a contemporary or shortly thereafter contemporary of Maimonides. Nachmanides equates Azazel with Samael, this other being from kind of a mystical angelology. And says about Azazel that Azazel was like a fallen angel, some people would say demon or something like that, came to earth and gave us two things. Let's say warfare and cosmetics. One of these things is not like the other, right? So it says that Azazel or Samael taught humans the art of warfare, how to smelt swords, how to smelt metal and turn them into swords and armor, and really created sort of collected intentional violence, right? They didn't invent murder. Cain and Abel did that, but only with the teaching of Azazel did we get this kind of collective violence of warfare. And also, it says he taught women how to dye their hair and put on makeup so that they could appear as, other than their natural beauty. And so I don't want to go too deep on that train. I know lots of women who wear cosmetics and things like that for reasons to help them, with their own appearance and self-esteem. Has nothing to do with duplicity, but that's kind of how Nachmanides saw it. He was a bit of a stick in the mud. Read some of his commentaries on Rambam. And so he's saying, Azazel is the fallen angel that gave humanity violence and duplicity. And this explains the generation of the flood, like how bad people had gotten that God decided to wipe everybody out and start over with Noah. This is where Azazel pops up, at least according to the Apocrypha. Others say that Azazel was sort of a demon that dwelt in the wilderness. And when we say and it says in the Torah, when you designate this goat for Azazel, you don't sacrifice it like you did the goat for Yud He Vav He. You take this goat and then you do something with it that I'll get to in a second, and then you send it off into the wilderness for Azazel. And so some say that Azazel was this sort of spirit entity or demon that dwelled in the wilderness. And what you did to the goat before you sent it off is this was the procedure for Aharon, the high priest, or whoever would be the high priest after him. He would put his hands, this was on Yom Kippur, he would put his hands on the head of this goat and make this kind of broad confession of all the sins of the people Israel, right? He would say, okay, for everything that everybody, and he didn't get specific and didn't name names. It's actually spelled out what that particular, the verbiage of that in the Mishnah. But he basically said, okay, for all the things that this community has done wrong and is atoning for, I'm confessing them here with my hands on this goat's head, and effectively sort of transmitting that sin or putting that sin into the goat, and then you send off this goat full of sin to be eaten by a demon in the wilderness or something like that. And this raises a lot of questions, right? First off, it gives us the term scapegoat, where a scapegoat, nowadays, when we think of a scapegoat, we talk about a person or a people or an idea or a thing where we kind of blame our own problems on this other person, or on this other community, or on some other event. Like we sort of disown our own sins and say, we're not having trouble because of something we did. We're having trouble because of something they did. And you put all of your sins in an external location, and then you sacrifice that or you release that into the wild, and somehow that expiates you. And so while this particular story is where we get the phrase scapegoat, it's really only a partial understanding of what's happening there on Yom Kippur. People would say that just seems like a cheat. Like somebody said earlier, we had a discussion about this in the Jew Curious School. It seems like people aren't really taking responsibility for their own sins. They're just sort of transmitting them someplace else and sending it away without actually doing the work of tshuva that would make them better people in the long run, right? This is sort of this vicarious atonement seems lazy, seems irresponsible, certainly doesn't seem effective in creating positive change or growth. And that's why, in general, scapegoating is not a good tactic for positive change, right? And it's poignant for me that it comes up during Yom Hashoah, this parsha about the scapegoat. I wonder how often these things coincide. Is because Jews, even though we gave the world this story about the scapegoat, have been a primary scapegoat for many cultures throughout time, right? Pharaoh was worried that, wasn't really worried about us per se, but was worried that we might combine with one of their other enemies and be their downfall. Haman said the same thing about this. There's a people apart, he says to Ahasuerus, there's a people apart from you who don't follow your laws. And maybe if we get rid of this people, we can expunge all of the evil in our community and they can be, kind of a scapegoat for us. And Hitler did the same thing. They were talking about reading at the Wiesenthal Center here in L.A., this letter that Hitler wrote as early as, I believe, 1919, post-World War I, when Germany was deep in poverty, and during the Weimar Republic, where they were basically printing money to pay off war debts, and there was hyperinflation, and it plunged Germany into poverty. And Hitler said, you know what? If I can pin this on the Jews somehow and escape all responsibility for our own deeds in World War I, and for our responsibility for restoring our own economy, it's basically this game of hide the ball. Like I could just put it over here and we can murder a bunch of people who don't deserve it, but that will help other people feel better that they've placed their sin someplace else. It'll help me rise to power, etc. So I don't want to speak for Hitler ever, but this seems to be what was happening. So we gave the world the story of the scapegoat, and yet throughout history we have become scapegoats for other people. We were blamed for the bubonic plague because our communities didn't suffer the same casualties from the plague because of various differences in hygienic practices between Jewish and non-Jewish communities. So people blamed us for the bubonic plague. They said, hey, you're healthy, we're not. You must be poisoning us or causing this somehow. And so the problem with scapegoating, the problem with blaming other people for your own problems, is that it never, first off, it's unjust, it's unfair. They don't deserve that. They didn't actually do that. It's also not effective in helping you grow. It's also not effective in helping you change and actually solve the real problems that you have. And so why does Aaron do it? Like, why does Aaron put his hands on this goat and send it out into the wilderness, having confessed all the sins of Israel? Is Israel atoned by this goat? No, because if that was true, that would be the end of Yom Kippur. That would be like the last thing that you do. But first off, we still do Yom Kippur even without this goat. And we spend the day fasting. We spend the day afflicting ourselves. We spend the day, intentionally avoiding comfort. in order to, as it, it says you should afflict your souls or afflict yourselves on Yom Kippur. And we translate that into fasting, avoiding intimate relations, avoiding comfortable shoes, avoiding, comfort in bathing and cosmetics and things like that. There's another connection to Samael in there. So that's the real work of Yom Kippur. And even before that, we're taught that to atone for things, to fix your problems, to mend relationships, you actually have to do the work of atonement. If you upset somebody or if you harm somebody, you have to go to them and apologize and make amends and change your life in such a way that you don't make that mistake again before God is remotely interested in your fasting. This is how Maimonides interprets tshuva. It says, praying and fasting on Yom Kippur, that's great for sins between you and God, and there's really no making amends to God except for praying and fasting and confessing. But God won't forgive anything that you did to another person until you sincerely try to mend fences or mend the relationship with that other person. Tshuva and atonement and getting right is hard work, and you can't do it with this goat, right? So why do we have the goat? Like, why do we have prayer on Yom Kippur? Like, why do we have these rituals that seem kind of far removed from the work that we're actually doing? And my argument is that these rituals, including the weird demon goat thing, is just a ritual to mark the occasion and really sear it into our minds what we are doing, right? A wedding is not a marriage, right? A wedding takes about an hour. It takes several months of planning sometimes, but the whole thing, when I do a wedding, we're done in about 30, 40 minutes. Then there's a reception, but it's however long the wedding is, it is God willing, it is a fraction of the time that a marriage takes. And so the real work of relationship takes place in the relationship before the wedding and hopefully the much longer relationship after the wedding. But we still have this wedding to focus everyone's attention publicly on in one moment and distill it in a symbolic way, in a very memorable way, right? Weddings are weird. Like, most of your marriage is not like a wedding. You don't wake up every morning next to somebody and then get out of bed and then break a glass, right? You don't break a glass at dinner. If you do, it's an accident, right? You don't, couples don't regularly circle one another 7 times like you do in a wedding. You don't have 7 blessings over a cup of wine every time you have a cup of wine, right? Weddings are weird. We do things that we don't normally do at any other time. And it's to remember that moment of consecration of the relationship. And I would argue that this thing with the goats is the same thing. Putting your sins into a goat and sending it away doesn't heal you, doesn't atone for those sins. But we don't do that thing any other time except on this occasion. And that helps us focus our attention on, okay, yes, we're confessing our sins or rather, Aaron is confessing for us the sins into this goat. But that's just so we know, hey, everybody, this is Yom Kippur. And on Yom Kippur, this is a synecdoche. This is a small part that represents the whole. This is just something to focus our attention to say, yes, we are disavowing all of these things that we did. And by the way, we've been doing that work and will continue to do that work. But in this moment, we are saying that this is what we did. This is not who we are. We are distancing ourselves from these deeds so that we'll remember for the rest of the year, like, oh, I'm tempted to go, punch somebody in the nose because he said something mean about me. But I already confessed that with the whole goat thing. And so maybe remembering that, I won't be so quick to go back to my old ways. And so my point is that, yes, we invented the whole thing with scapegoats. Yes, scapegoating is a common human activity. People, whenever they have some sort of deficit, usually something they're not proud of about themselves, sometimes it's easier to shift that blame to somebody else than to own that and actually grow. It's a natural human instinct to scapegoat others for our own problems. But this ritual of Yom Kippur calls to mind that, like, yes, you can simply declare, I don't want to be that guy anymore, but it takes the real work underneath to actually effectuate that. And that's why scapegoating is never effective. That's why, when whoever in New Zealand pinned all of their problems on the Muslim community and said, with this act of violence, I am distancing myself from stuff that I'm not proud of in myself. It didn't work. It worked to kill a lot of people. It worked perhaps unintentionally for that guy to bring a community together, to bring a world together in solidarity with that community. And yes, one kid in California scapegoated a Jewish community and said, okay, I'm going to take all of my anger and all of my hate and put it in these people and have an act of violence that will somehow mean something and, restore some sort of order that I've got in my head. And it was violent and it was a crime and it didn't work. The only thing that works is healing that anger between people. The only thing that works is us seeing each other for who we really are, for owning our part in rifts in relationships and doing something about that rather than just, the phrase I heard recently, blame storming, right? Think of all the reasons why it's not my fault. And so my blessing for you as we're reading about this weird thing about Aaron putting his hands on a goat and sending it out into the wilderness for the demon of swords and makeup is just to help when you hear this weird story, remember that this is a weird ritual that is actually intended to focus our attention on the work that we have to do ourselves. And I think if we do that work, if we really focus on the hate that we have to mend rather than blaming it on somebody else, I think we can make a lot of progress. So let me take a look. That's a lot of preaching. Let me take a look at the chat. Courtney asked, but what if something is someone else's fault? So I don't want to let everybody off the hook. I don't want to say like everything bad that happens is only my fault. And so, if something is somebody else's fault, that's not really scapegoating. That's sort of assigning responsibility. And it's okay to recognize that something is somebody else's fault, right? What I'm talking about is this idea that if the fault is really in you, don't think that you'll grow by blaming it on someone else, right? So speaking specifically about the case, don't think that somebody else is going to atone for something that you did. And that is a natural human instinct to sort of deny our own responsibility in things. So I'm not saying everything is our fault. Everything is just my fault all the time. I'm saying when it is my fault, I can't just put that on somebody else and think that I'm going to change. Right? Because then I'll just have the same error later, and then I might have to find a new person to blame it on, but I never get to break that cycle, right? So look, when something's legit somebody else's fault, seek justice, right? God willing, they attempt to atone for it because that's what their Yom Kippur is for. That's what their atonement is for. And people are encouraged to make amends to us, but we're also encouraged to be slow to anger and quick to forgive, not to get them off the hook. That's not what forgiveness is. It's not to say, okay, that wrong thing that you did is suddenly right. It's to say, whatever you did to me, I don't have to suffer that grudge indefinitely, right? And so was teaching about this in a class last night. We were talking about tshuva in the context of learning about the high holidays and going through Maimonides' different steps of tshuva from Hilchot Tshuva, chapter 2 in the Mishnah Torah. And we're talking about, okay, the procedure for asking for forgiveness and the procedure for giving forgiveness. And I asked people, like, what's harder, asking for forgiveness or granting it? And many people in the room said, forgiveness can feel harder sometimes. Like, I'm just not ready to forgive, right? Or I don't think that person's being sincere. Or if I forgive them, they'll never learn their lesson, right? I'm going to teach them a lesson by not forgiving them. And Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, former chief rabbi of the UK, I think, gives this great teaching on forgiveness and saying this is forgiveness is a radical disruptive technology, in the sense that if we were never able to forgive, if forgiveness did not exist in the world, we would be doomed to carry grudges forever, whether it was constructive or not, right? And forgiving someone isn't making right what they did, but it is saying that wrong will not, it hurt me once, I'm not going to let it keep hurting me, right? And it's not necessarily, forgiveness isn't necessarily most impactful on the person you're forgiving. It's probably most impactful on you several times. So this is a hard thing. We'll talk about this more when we get to the high holidays, but forgiveness is tough. I'm not going to argue with you. And sometimes we don't feel like forgiving, but I'll suggest that, as Maimonides does, that we should have a disposition, or we should cultivate a kind of disposition that makes us slow to anger and quick to forgive, if not for their sake, for your own sake. As Grycicle shares, you can't grow in love, which is the goal, by acting with violence, right? And so I think that's true as well. Kathy shares, for example, in AA, Kathy asks, do you have any tips for making amends to other people? It sounds a little awkward. For example, in AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, they say, make a list of people you've wronged. What was interesting is after I was teaching about tshuva last night, somebody came up to me and said, this sounds a lot like AA. This sounds a lot like this stuff in the big book. And so, not for nothing, there's a great organization in Los Angeles, Beit Tshuva, that combines, it's a residential addiction recovery place, and they combine the 12 steps with Maimonides' teachings on tshuva, or other, not just Maimonides, but teachings on tshuva, because AA and tshuva, I'm less familiar with AA, but apparently AA and tshuva go hand in hand. So do I have any tips? Like, is there any sort of easy path to making amends? I wish. I really do. I think the first thing is you have to acknowledge and recognize that you did something wrong, first for your own sake, before you talk to anybody else. And then Maimonides says, look, you should just go to that person and say, look, I did this wrong thing, and I'm sorry, and I'd like to make it up to you. Please forgive me. And if that person says no, you're supposed to go back to them, and it says you should bring 3 friends with you. And you can think of a lot of different reasons for this. One is that kind of moral support may be required. If you've been rejected once, it might hurt too much, but if you have friends with you, it might be a little easier. It also changes that from a private apology into a public apology, which might be more acceptable to the person. And if they reject you, then you're supposed to try again 2 more times to go back with 3 friends. So that's 4 attempts at apology. That's 1 private and 3 public. And it says, after you have gone back this many times and a person still will not forgive you, you are, as the rabbis say, yotzi. You've sort of discharged your responsibilities. You don't have to go back again. And, you've done the best you can. And it says of a person, who doesn't forgive after all these sincere attempts have been made, that you shouldn't be cruel. As Maimonides says, somebody who refuses to forgive after repeated sincere attempts, that's an act of cruelty, and that's not something that we should cultivate. So there's no easy way to say you're sorry, right? I know there are some easy ways that are terrible. It's things like, I'm really sorry you feel that way. Or I'm really sorry that you're so insensitive that you don't understand that what I did was totally okay. Right? That's an example of a terrible apology that I've heard many times and probably have made myself. Certainly in my life, have said, "I'm sorry you feel that way," when it was sort of a fake apology, and I'm guilty because I'm human. But yeah, if you really want to make amends with somebody, just go, mea maxima culpa, as they say, I think, in other circles. Just say, look, I did this thing. I take responsibility for it. Please forgive me. And whatever I have to, and then if you need to make up for it somehow, let's say you ding somebody's car in the parking lot and you got to pay for their bumper or something, then make a sincere effort to do what you can in that regard. And so I think it's just I'll say one of the bravest things a person can do is admit fault, admit deficit, admit a mistake, and ask another person for forgiveness, because you really are sort of, you become sort of a supplicant in a way. It's like, I'm really putting them, by giving them the power to forgive me, I'm putting them above myself. And that takes a lot of courage and a lot of humility to do that. I'm not discounting it in any way and just say, oh, just go ask forgiveness for everybody. No, that's hard work. And it's important, right? Because if you are trying to change a pattern of behavior in yourself that is very ingrained, habits are very tough to change. Just dispositions are very tough to change. And things that are hard to change only change through hard work. And so the best thing you could do is just be honest with somebody. Say, I did this thing. I am sorry for it. I do regret it. If given the same circumstances, I wouldn't do it again. How do we make this right? Please forgive me. That's hard work, but it's necessary, not only for mending that relationship, but for your own growth. And I'll say just as hard, sometimes harder, is being the person to say, thank you, and I forgive you. And there was a teacher of mine, Abby Pfeiffer Mandel, who teaches sort of change management at the USC Business School. And she said, it was like the high holidays a couple of years ago, and she was saying, I think something that our society, and I think she was talking about contemporary United States, she's like, there's sort of two things that our society has a really hard time doing or saying. Something that we could use a lot more of is the words, I'm sorry, and I forgive you. And I think both of those are true. I think we have a hard time admitting fault because we don't like ceding that kind of power to people. And I think we also are very loath to say, I forgive you, in this age of identity politics. And as Rabbi Sachs says, because I have a grievance, I have an identity. We base our identity on who we're mad at and what ticks us off and what we feel assaulted by, rather than the change that we can actually make in the world. We go around blaming people for things and holding on and nursing that righteous anger and grudge as a source of identity for ourselves. When I think there's a lot more positive stuff that we can base our identity. I don't want to let anybody off the hook for injustices. Far be it for me to say that. But if we could say just a little bit more, I'm sorry and I forgive you, rather than perpetuating the cycle of ineffective scapegoating, I think we can make a lot of progress. And that's just progress in civil society, progress in political economy, progress in stopping the current trend of it being open season on human beings, which I think has to stop. But I think the only way it stops is if we can be humble enough to ask for forgiveness, to give forgiveness, and to see other people as created in the divine image as we are. So that's just something I wanted to pass along to you guys today. As Grycicle shares, grudges only hurt you, so you'll have to do the work of communication and forgiveness sooner or later. Right? They say that a grudge, just my interpretation is this old saying, they say holding a grudge is like drinking poison to make the other person sick. Right? We hold on to this stuff that hurts us in the hope that it will injure somebody else. But really, it may, but it definitely injures us, which I think should be avoided. So I'm going to see what else is going on in the chat here. I know I was kind of rambling for a while, so I missed a lot of. If anybody has a question that you want answered, I know we're running we're about out of time. But if anybody has a question, please throw the question back in the chat with a question mark on it, so that is it's easier for me to see. Oh, somebody was mentioning kaparot before Yom Kippur, and somebody asked me about kaparot last night, and I forgot to answer that question. Kaparot is a traditional practice that we don't much do anymore. So Drake from Huntsville asked, does any Jewish sect still practice any form of animal sacrifice? And so I'll say in modern times, there is a related group of people called the Sumerians. I don't really know, is it Sumerian or Samaritans? Samaritans. So there are communities in the Holy Land. There are communities of Samaritans still. If you've heard in the Gospels, there's a story about the Good Samaritan. This was talking about a particular group of people, and the Good Samaritan is sort of like an almost ironic phrase because everybody hated Samaritans. Like anybody hearing this story, sort of default thought a Samaritan was a bad person, and that's why when this Samaritan acted well, that's why it was such an effective parable. But there are still Samaritans out there today. And if you're in Jerusalem nearby, there's a Samaritan community. And I know somebody, it's like a friend of a friend. I wasn't there myself, but somebody I know went to a Samaritan Passover, and they still slaughter the Paschal lamb. And so it's not exactly Judaism as rabbinic Judaism is today, but it is a related group of people who do animal sacrifices. By and large, rabbinic Jews, when we talk about Jews, the people we're talking about don't do animal sacrifices. And and Ari brought up kaparot. So this isn't something I understand super well because it's not really practiced in communities that I've been a part of, but there is something from the old country and still practiced in really traditional communities today of kaparot, or some people say in Yiddish schleppen kaparis, because what you do is before Yom Kippur, you take a chicken and you sort of make a confession while you're holding this chicken. So it sounds a little bit like what Aaron was doing with the goat. And then you'll kind of wave it over your head. And that's how you get rid of some of your sins. And then the chickens are killed, but it's not an act of sacrifice for God. It's an act of tzedakah, because the chickens that are then killed are then given to feed people who can't afford chickens. And I'll say in more contemporary versions of this, or more evolved versions of this, is that people would say take money and put in a handkerchief and make the same kind of confession and wave the handkerchief full of money over their heads, and then they give that money to tzedakah and give that money to charity to help somebody, to further distance it from the appearance of animal sacrifice. So it's not a sacrifice. It is confessing sins while holding an animal, but then the animal is given to charity, not like sacrificed in some kind of temple ritual. So it looks a little bit like animal sacrifice. And if you go to Pico Robertson, which is a particular neighborhood in Los Angeles with a heavy Jewish population, you will see people doing this before Yom Kippur. They take up a parking lot. They have a bunch of cages of chickens. They have people coming and doing this. And there's even like a guy in a chicken suit who walks around and said, "Hey, it's kaparot time." So it's a weird thing to see. I don't want to judge them. They have their traditions. I have mine. So that's something that looks kind of like animal sacrifice, but really isn't. And it sounds kind of like this story about the scapegoat, but there's no Ozs L involved. One of our newer audience members, Mamo, says, "I was attacked racially, so after complaining about prejudices, I just said I will start with my own. Was a really great experience." And so that's hard. That is hard work, I'll say. So kol hakavod, Mamo, and thank you for sharing that with us. I mean, I think when we are attacked because we are prejudged, the instinct is to kind of bristle and deflect and say, just to be angry and sad, as people have been feeling this week about Poway. But I think the harder thing, and you get to feel angry and you get to feel sad about this stuff, and you should expect people to see people brought to justice. The harder thing to do is to recognize that same kind of bad instinct in yourself and work on fixing your own prejudices. So I just want to acknowledge what a brave and difficult that thing is to do, and thank you for doing it. And I think if people worked on themselves when they felt like lashing out against somebody else, I think we'd have a much less violent place to live right now. Courtney asked the question. She says, Rabbi Singer in Indonesia has a Muslim prayer room in his synagogue. He likes everyone, but he says Christians can't go on synagogue property. Is that true? I'm not going to speak to Rabbi Singer's property. That's if he's the Maradatra there, that's up to him. Generally speaking, it's not a prohibition in Jewish law for Christians to enter a Jewish property. And there are some places where, especially in very sort of lockdown, secure places in the world, where they don't let a lot of people into synagogues that don't have a reason for being there because they're more worried about sort of direct terrorist violence and things like that. But it's not because they're Christian or because something else. It's just because they don't know them. And so if Rabbi Singer says that Christians can't come onto synagogue property, to his synagogue property, I'm not going to argue with that. No synagogue that I've ever been a member of or a rabbi of or a part of has ever had that policy. And I would say just the opposite. The more Christians get to observe what Jewish ritual looks like, the less distance, the less misunderstanding, ignorance, animosity, and prejudice will exist between Christians and Jews. And so whenever I had the opportunity as a synagogue rabbi to host people who weren't Jewish to see what our thing was, I relished it. We had people come from Catholic schools, would send groups, or people from the local public schools would come in, with a very diverse religious background, would come in. And I would explain, like, here's how a synagogue service goes. Or I would have people, had a group of girls from a Catholic school come and visit us during services. And I said, okay, just feel free to enjoy. We're not gonna be talking about Jesus a whole lot. Just want to prepare you for that, if at all. And but just hang around, and I'm here to answer whatever questions you have afterwards. And I love those moments because, there are those folks out there who are completely ignorant of Jewish practice, who think that we still sacrifice animals, who think that, who have an opinion about Judaism and have this prejudgment about how Judaism is, how Jews are, what Jews do, based on stories from other people rather than direct observation. And as soon as they observe that we are human just like they are human, we love our children just as much as they love their children, and our rituals are no more bloody or bizarre than any of their rituals, then it breaks down that barrier of misunderstanding, and then we can start having a real conversation about our common humanity and our common presence in the same community. So I actually encourage, there's limits. There are Christians who come into synagogues and then shout out praise Jesus during the Shema or something like that, and they're there for like guerrilla tactics to disrupt the service. And I've had that happen, or I've heard, I've heard about that happening in synagogues that I'm a part of when I wasn't there. But that's a thing that people do, and that guy gets the door right away. Like there's always some big guys around to frog march that guy out, but that's rare. And it's exceptional. For the most part, if people just want to come in and observe services, I totally encourage that. Answer whatever questions they have, because I think that lowers barriers. And then you deal with the kooks, and then you deal with the people who want to be disruptive and disrespectful as best you can. But you don't, raise the gates against everybody just to prevent a few bad actors. All right, with that, we've been going about 75 minutes now. Just looking over the chat to make sure I don't miss anything. Ari is saying, I just finished cleaning my kitchen from Passover. I think the matzah crumb thing is perpetual. That was an irony that was raised for me last week. Why do we work so hard to get rid of all of the crumbs in our house before Passover so that we can eat something that makes that is matzah that makes 10 times as many crumbs easily. There's something about matzah that it like makes more crumbs than its own actual volume. It like defies physics. Matzah is the stuff that makes more crumbs than anything I know about. And so that happens. And even after Passover, you're still finding matzah crumbs everywhere. Grysicle asks, Rabbi, was the old animal sacrifice like a feast? The animals were killed immediately at the temple. And so, yes, in the my understanding is that the sacrifices, while they were done sort of for the sake of God, and certain parts of the animal were burned in their entirety, most of the animal was then eaten by the people present. And this was actually how the priests and the Levites in the vicinity got fed, right? The priests are, the Kohanim are kind of a subset of the tribe of Levi. And when they were drawing up property lines and things like that in the promised land, each tribe got its own sort of parcel of land to divide up amongst the tribe, but the Levites got no land, right? Which means if you got no land, you had no way of feeding yourself. And so how the priests were fed was through donations to the temple, including the animals that were sacrificed. And you can read in the particulars of the Torah, when animals were sacrificed, again, certain parts, suet, certain organs or things like that were burned entirely. But most of, the good eaten meats were left over, and that was called truma. This is when this is what the priests would eat, because they would get the offerings that people made. And there's lots of talk about like the tithing and bringing in 1/10 of your produce and bringing in first fruits and things like that. That stuff wasn't just thrown away, and it wasn't all burned up to feed God. God doesn't need to eat. But certain aspects of it were destroyed to create this sweet smell that God appreciated. But most of it was eaten by humans. And so it was like a feast. And it said, even when you bring your own sacrifices, and it wasn't just eaten by the priests, when you bring your own sacrifices, yes, there's sacrifice there, but everybody gets to eat. The Shalosh Regalim, the 3 pilgrimage festivals, were a time of eating and drinking and making merry, right? And people would bring things to Jerusalem, to the temple, and everybody got to have a feast. And actually learn more about this, both from the Torah and the Mishnah and commentaries, but also it describes a lot of this stuff in the Iliad as well, which if you follow kind of when the period of time that the Iliad was supposed to be describing, it actually tracks quite well with the time. It's sort of the period of the Iliad. This is Homer's epic poem about Achilles and Agamemnon and all those folks. And they talk about how people did religion and how people would sacrifice parts of the animal, and then the rest of them they would have a feast. This actually fleshed out my understanding a lot more of how it was done in Jerusalem as well, only we did it for the sake of one God, not a pantheon of gods. All right, everybody. I really appreciate everyone being here today, and I appreciate people asking their questions and being supportive of one another in this community, as always. And just going to say a few words to close out the podcast. God willing, I get it recorded and up in the cloud sometime soon. I want to give massive thanks to the live studio audience and say thank you, Hero, for listening to the Jew Curious School. I want to give mad shout outs to everybody in the live studio audience today, and thank you especially, Hero, for listening to the Jew Curious Show. If you'd like to connect with other people in this community, first off, I highly recommend you join one of our live chats. You can be in the studio audience with us, ask your questions, get them answered live, and then those answers will help other people who have the same questions that you do. who have the same questions that you do. Another great way to connect with Jew-curious people just like you is to join us in the Jew-Curious Community Center. And you can join that, and that is a private Facebook group that is lovingly tended and carefully guarded to be troll-free. And you can join us there by going to jewcurious.show/JCC, as in Jew Curious Community Center. Finally, I would be remiss if I did not let you know that this podcast is made possible by the Jew Curious School. If you are looking for a place to get in-depth learning on some basic and not so basic things about Judaism, about the Jewish people and our traditions, in the company of Jew-curious people of all kinds of backgrounds, just like you, with a rabbi who has been around and gets you, then the Jew Curious School might be for you. We have regular live classes. We have over 60 hours of recorded lessons, both video and audio. But my favorite thing is the community forum, where members share their stories, share their struggles, and share support with one another, and the occasional recipe and joke as well. That can be found also in the Jew Curious School. If you want to see if this is right for you, just go to jewcurious.school/info and check it out. Thank you again for learning with me today. I look forward to our continuing learning together. And until next time, hero, peace. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate your being here for this. Once again, if you're a regular in the live studio audience here, just my apologies, but also my forecast that it's going to be a little bit irregular for a while. Like I said, I have this sort of ongoing, or let's say I have this renewed commitment to focusing on my health, and I'm still sorting out what all that means. And so someday, real soon, I hope to have, once again, a stable schedule for these discussions. I'm also considering experimenting with other live streaming platforms like Facebook and this thing called Twitch TV. I don't know if anybody's familiar with Twitch. If you like Twitch, say yay Twitch, so I know somebody out there has heard of it. So thinking about that. And so things are going to be changing up here a little bit in the near future. And I trust this community to give me feedback, whether you like it, whether you don't like it. I do appreciate people checking in with me if they haven't heard from me for a while. But whatever changes there are, whatever new things are coming, I'll be blasting them out to my email list and sharing them on Facebook as best I can. And so just stay tuned for all that. Thank you for being part of this journey so far. And who knows where we're going to go next, but if we go together, I know it's going to be awesome. So as Ari says, good Shabbos, everyone. Good Shabbos, Ari. Shabbat Shalom. And really, after kind of a tough week, take this Shabbos to really relax, reflect, and work on improving those relationships so that wherever we go next, we can go there stronger together. Until next time, heroes, peace.